In Tokyo, people sleep in capsules no larger than coffins. One morning, a man was found dead inside Capsule 47. The door had never been opened. The air system was working, and yet he suffocated.
Prologue: The Capsules. Tokyo never truly slept. Even at 3 in the morning, the city hummed like a living machine. Trains moved beneath the streets. Neon lights reflected on rain-soaked pavement. Vending machines glowed on quiet corners like small electronic lighthouses guiding the sleepless through the night. And above the streets, hidden between office towers and narrow alleyways, there were places designed for people who did not want to go home. Capsule hotels. The Hikari Capsule residence stood on a quiet side street in Shinjuku, its entrance marked by a narrow vertical sign glowing softly in white light. Inside, the lobby was silent. A row of automated check-in terminals lined the wall beside the entrance. Most guests never spoke to another human being during their stay. They simply scanned their ID, received a locker number, and disappeared into the sleeping floors above. The hotel was designed for efficiency. No wasted space, no wasted time, no unnecessary interaction. In a city of 14 million people, anonymity had become a luxury. The sleeping floors were arranged like honeycombs. Long corridors stretched beneath dim blue lighting, and along both walls, stacked rows of capsule compartments formed a grid of small rectangular doors. Each capsule was roughly 2 meters long and 1 meter high, just enough space for a person to lie down, no more. Inside each unit there was a small mattress, a pillow, a touchscreen control panel, adjustable lighting, and a quiet ventilation system that pumped filtered air through the capsule throughout the night. Guests slid inside, closed the lightweight privacy door, and disappeared into their own tiny world. Some watched movies, some answered emails, some simply slept. In the Hikari residence, more than 200 people could rest in these capsules every night, stacked 2 levels high along the corridors like drawers in a giant cabinet. And yet, most of them never learned the names of the people sleeping inches away. At 23:14, a man checked in. The camera above the entrance recorded everything automatically. He appeared tired. 35, perhaps 40 years old, business attire slightly wrinkled. His tie hung loose around his collar, and the slow heaviness of his movements suggested the kind of exhaustion that came from a long day that had not gone well. The check-in terminal displayed a room assignment: Capsule 47, second row, middle corridor. He took the key card, placed his shoes in the assigned locker, and walked silently up the narrow staircase toward the sleeping level. No one noticed him. That was the point of places like this. The corridor lights dimmed automatically at midnight. By then, most of the capsules were already occupied. Behind each door, someone breathed quietly in the darkness. Capsule 44, Capsule 45, Capsule 46, and then Capsule 47. The small privacy panel slid shut with a soft click. Inside, the man lay down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling panel glowing faintly above him. The control screen beside his head displayed the system menu: sleep mode, lighting, ventilation, alarm clock. He selected sleep mode. The capsule lights dimmed. The ventilation shifted to a quieter setting designed to mimic natural nighttime airflow. Outside, the corridor fell silent again. At 02:16, something changed. No one heard it. Capsule hotels were designed precisely so that no one would. The ventilation system continued to hum softly through the walls. A train passed somewhere beneath the street. Someone in Capsule 62 rolled over in their sleep. But in Capsule 47, the air inside the compartment began to change. not suddenly, slowly, almost imperceptibly.
The capsule remained sealed. The door had not been opened. The system logs would later confirm that. And yet the oxygen level inside the small compartment began to fall. Inside the capsule, the man woke. At first, he did not understand why. Sleep in confined spaces often brought strange sensations. The mind sometimes interpreted the narrow dimensions of the capsule as pressure or movement. He blinked slowly in the darkness. The air felt wrong, heavy. His chest tightened slightly as he inhaled. He reached toward the control panel beside his head. The display glowed softly. Sleep mode active. He frowned. Something about the air felt wrong. He tapped the ventilation icon. The screen responded normally. Airflow level, standard. Everything appeared normal, but the air did not feel normal. He sat up slowly, his head nearly touching the ceiling of the capsule. The confined space suddenly felt much smaller. His breathing quickened. He tapped the panel again. Ventilation remained active. Everything was working, and yet each breath felt thinner than the last. He slid the privacy door open, or tried to. It did not move. The capsule door was not locked. These doors rarely were, but the design required the occupant to push it outward with a steady motion. In the narrow confines of the capsule, panic made simple movements difficult. His breathing grew faster. Air. He needed air. His hand moved quickly across the control panel again. Ventilation, emergency button, lighting. The screen flickered briefly. For a moment, the capsule lights brightened, then dimmed again. His chest tightened sharply. He tried to shout, but the sound barely traveled beyond the thin walls of the compartment. Capsule hotels were built to isolate noise. Minutes passed, or perhaps seconds. Inside the tiny compartment, time stopped behaving normally. The man's breathing became erratic. His vision blurred. The edges of the capsule seemed to close inward around him, like the inside of a box that had suddenly become too small. His hand slid weakly across the control panel one last time. Then it stopped moving. At 0632, the morning staff began their routine check. Capsule hotels did not wake guests with loud announcements or knocking on doors. The system simply activated the overhead corridor lights and gradually increased the ventilation noise to signal the start of the day. Guests usually emerged slowly from their compartments, stretching, yawning, checking their phones. But Capsule 47 remained closed. The attendant noticed it immediately. Some guests overslept, but the control system usually registered movement inside the unit. Capsule 47 showed none. The attendant tapped the door lightly. No response. He pushed the panel open. The man lay on the mattress exactly where he had fallen. Eyes open. Body still.
The control screen beside him glowed faintly. Sleep mode active. The ventilation system hummed quietly, working perfectly. 2 hours later, the police sealed the corridor. Technicians examined the ventilation system. The logs showed no malfunction, no interruption, no mechanical failure. The capsule had never opened during the night, and yet the man inside had suffocated. When Edward Hale first read the report later that afternoon, he closed the file slowly. Capsule hotels were designed to solve a very simple problem: how to store sleeping humans in the smallest possible space. But small spaces had a peculiar relationship with death, because once a door closed, there were very few places for the truth to hide. Edward looked at the photograph of the capsule. Capsule 47, 2 meters long, 1 meter high, 1 door, and a dead man inside. He smiled faintly, because rooms that small rarely kept their secrets for long. Chapter 1. The Corridor. Edward Hale arrived at the Hikari Capsule residence shortly after noon. The rain had stopped, but the streets of Shinjuku still glistened with the gray reflection of skyscrapers and neon signs. Tokyo always looked slightly unreal after rain, as if the city had been freshly polished overnight. Edward paused beneath the narrow vertical sign of the hotel, Hikari Capsule Residence. From the outside, the building looked like any other small urban hotel, 7 floors of glass and steel squeezed between a noodle restaurant and a convenience store. Nothing about it suggested that someone had died in a box barely larger than a coffin, which was exactly why Edward had come. Places that appeared ordinary often worked very hard to remain that way. Inside, the lobby was almost silent. A receptionist sat behind a minimalist white desk, her posture stiff with the kind of nervous professionalism that appeared whenever police officers had visited recently. Detective Kenji Nakamura stood beside the desk when Edward entered. Nakamura was in his early 40s, calm and deliberate in the way many Tokyo detectives were. His suit immaculate, his movements economical. He inclined his head slightly. "Mr. Hale," he said. Edward returned the gesture. "Detective Nakamura." They had worked together once before on a case involving a shipping company and a man who had managed to disappear inside a warehouse without leaving through any of the exits. Nakamura had not forgotten. "Locked rooms seem to follow you," the detective said. Edward smiled faintly. "Or perhaps I follow them." Nakamura handed him a pair of disposable shoe covers. "Standard procedure," he said. Edward slipped them on. "Tell me what you know so far," he said. Nakamura led him toward the staircase. The victim's name was Ryo Tanaka, 38, systems analyst for a telecommunications company. Edward nodded. "Cause of death?" "Officially, oxygen deprivation." Edward frowned slightly. "Inside a functioning capsule?" "Yes." They climbed the narrow stairs toward the sleeping floor. The corridor lights had been turned fully on now, removing the usual nighttime dimness that capsule hotels preferred. Edward stepped into the hallway and immediately understood why the case had puzzled the police. The corridor looked like something halfway between a hotel and a storage facility. Rows of capsule compartments lined both sides of the hallway in precise geometric order. 2 levels, identical white doors, each one marked only by a number. Capsule 41.
Capsule 42. Capsule 43. The effect was strangely disorienting. From a distance, the capsules resembled drawers in a filing cabinet, except the files inside them were human beings. Edward walked slowly down the corridor. "Occupancy last night?" he asked. 87%, Nakamura replied. Edward glanced at the doors. "So nearly 200 people slept here." "Yes." "And none of them heard anything unusual?" Nakamura shook his head. "These walls are heavily insulated." Edward nodded. That much was obvious. Capsule hotels depended on silence. They stopped in front of a door labeled 47. Police tape sealed the compartment. Nakamura peeled it back. "Ready?" he asked. Edward nodded. The door slid open with a soft, mechanical whisper. Edward leaned slightly forward and looked inside. The interior of the capsule was even smaller than it had appeared in the photographs. A thin mattress covered the floor. A pillow rested against the back wall. The control panel glowed softly near where the occupant's head would rest. Everything looked clean, orderly, almost peaceful, except for the faint chalk mark where the body had been removed earlier that morning. Edward crouched slightly and leaned into the compartment. He had to be careful not to bump his head against the ceiling. The air inside smelled faintly sterile, filtered, recycled, processed. "How long was he inside before he died?" Edward asked. Nakamura checked his notes.
Approximately 3 hours. Edward nodded slowly. That's a long time to suffocate. Nakamura folded his arms. Which is why we're having this conversation. Edward studied the capsule carefully. The ventilation grill sat near the foot of the compartment. A thin stream of cool air flowed steadily through it. He placed his hand near the opening. The airflow was steady, normal. "System logs?" Edward asked. "Show no interruption," Nakamura said. Edward nodded. "So the oxygen supply never stopped." "That's correct." Edward leaned back slightly. "And the door?" Nakamura gestured toward the electronic lock panel. "Opened only once," he said. Edward looked at him. "When?" Nakamura replied quietly. "This morning, when the staff found the body." Edward studied the door frame carefully. Capsule doors were simple sliding panels designed more for privacy than security. They locked electronically, but could always be opened manually from the inside. Could someone open it from the outside? Nakamura shook his head. "Not without the access card." Edward nodded. "And the card?" "Tanaka's locker." Edward exhaled slowly. Edward leaned further into the capsule. The control screen beside the pillow displayed the same message it had shown in the photographs. Sleep mode active.
He tapped the panel. The interface woke immediately. Lighting controls, ventilation settings, alarm clock, all functioning. Edward tilted his head slightly. "Sleep mode," he said. Nakamura nodded. "Most guests use it." Edward studied the menu. "What does it do?" "Reduces noise," Nakamura said. "Dims the lights." Edward nodded. "And the ventilation?" The detective hesitated. "Lower airflow," he said. Edward looked at him. "How much lower?" Nakamura shrugged. "Enough to make the capsule quieter." Edward leaned back slowly. That was interesting. Edward crawled carefully out of the capsule and stood in the corridor. Then he looked up. Capsule hotels stacked sleeping compartments 2 levels high. Above Capsule 47 sat Capsule 93. Below it, the mirrored unit, Capsule 1. Edward pointed upward. Who slept above him? Nakamura checked his notes. Tourist from Osaka. And below? A delivery driver. Edward nodded. Did they hear anything? No. Edward smiled faintly. Of course not. Edward walked slowly down the corridor again. Capsule 44, Capsule 45, Capsule 46. He stopped again in front of 47. Something about the space still bothered him. The capsule was too small, too controlled, too mechanical. Rooms designed this carefully rarely failed by accident. Edward turned to Nakamura. "Tell me about the ventilation system," he said. Nakamura frowned slightly. "We checked it." Edward nodded. "I believe you." The detective waited. Edward glanced once more at the capsule door. "But ventilation systems don't decide to kill people," Edward said quietly. Nakamura folded his arms. "Then what does?" Edward looked down the corridor. Rows and rows of identical white capsules stretched into the distance like the cells of some enormous sleeping machine. He smiled faintly. "Something much simpler," he said. Edward pointed toward the capsule again. "People assume the victim died because the air stopped flowing." Nakamura nodded. "That's the logical conclusion." Edward shook his head. "No," he said. He paused. "The logical conclusion," Edward looked at the tiny compartment, "is that the air was never the problem." The detective frowned. Then what was? Edward glanced once more at the capsule. 2 meters long, 1 meter high, a sealed sleeping box in the middle of a city that never slept. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. "The problem," he said quietly, "was the box itself." Chapter 2. The Air System.
Edward Hale had learned something important about modern machines. The more automated they became, the more invisible their decisions were. People trusted systems they did not understand, especially systems designed to look clean, quiet, and efficient. The ventilation system of the Hikari capsule residence was exactly that kind of machine. The control room sat one floor below the sleeping level. Unlike the corridors above, the space here looked unapologetically mechanical. Metal ductwork ran along the ceiling. Control panels blinked quietly in rows along the walls, and a faint humming vibration filled the room like the distant sound of an airplane engine. A technician in a Navy maintenance uniform stood beside a large monitoring screen. Detective Nakamura introduced him. "This is Takashi Mori, chief engineer for the building." Takashi bowed slightly. "I maintain the air system," he said. Edward nodded. "That's exactly what I want to talk about." Takashi pulled up a digital diagram of the building. The blueprint appeared on the screen in glowing blue lines. "Each capsule has an independent airflow channel," Takashi explained. "Fresh air enters through the floor vent and exits through the upper circulation system." Edward studied the diagram. "So every capsule receives oxygen directly from the central system?" "Yes." "And the system never stopped working?" Takashi shook his head firmly. "Never." Edward believed him. Mechanical failures usually left fingerprints. There were none here. Edward stepped closer to the screen. "What about sleep mode?" he asked. Takashi nodded. "That reduces airflow." Edward waited. "How much?" Takashi hesitated. "About 40%. Edward raised an eyebrow. "That seems significant." Takashi shrugged. "The capsules are very small," he said. "They do not require much air." Edward nodded slowly. 2 meters by 1 meter, roughly the volume of a large refrigerator. Small spaces did not need much oxygen, but they also lost it quickly. Edward studied the airflow diagram carefully. Thin blue arrows moved through the digital capsules like tiny rivers of light. "Show me capsule 47, he said. Takashi zoomed in to the second floor. Capsule 47 appeared highlighted. The airflow indicator showed a steady stream entering the compartment. "See?" Takashi said. "Airflow remained constant all night." Edward nodded. "Yes," but he kept staring at the diagram. "Tell me something," Edward said. Takashi looked at him. "If the airflow is reduced 40% in sleep mode..." Takashi nodded. "Yes." Edward continued.
How long would it take for oxygen levels to drop if the capsule were sealed? Takashi frowned. But it isn't sealed. Edward nodded calmly. I know. He pointed at the diagram. I'm asking a hypothetical question. Takashi hesitated. Then he typed several commands. A simulation appeared on the screen. Volume of capsule, airflow rate, oxygen consumption of a sleeping adult. The numbers moved across the display. Takashi frowned as he read them. Well, he said slowly, if the airflow stopped completely, Edward waited, it would take roughly 20 minutes for oxygen levels to become dangerous. Edward nodded. And fatal? Takashi glanced at the screen again. 30 to 40 minutes. Edward looked thoughtful. That's faster than most people expect. Takashi nodded. Small spaces, he said. Edward turned away from the screen. But the airflow didn't stop, he said. Takashi nodded. Correct. Edward walked slowly across the room. Then he stopped. There's another possibility, he said. Nakamura looked at him. What? Edward glanced back at the ventilation diagram. The airflow never stopped, he said, but the air itself may have changed.
Takashi blinked. "What do you mean?" Edward pointed at the system diagram again. "Where does the air come from?" he asked. Takashi gestured upward. "Central filtration unit on the roof." Edward nodded. "And the air leaving the capsule?" "Recycled through the exhaust system." Edward leaned against the console. "So air moves in a loop?" Takashi nodded. "Yes." Edward looked at him carefully. "What happens if the exhaust becomes blocked?" Takashi frowned. "That shouldn't happen." Edward waited. "But if it did," Takashi continued slowly, "carbon dioxide would accumulate." Edward nodded. "And oxygen levels would fall." Takashi stared at the diagram again. "Yes." Edward folded his arms. "How long would that take?" Takashi ran another simulation. The numbers moved quickly across the screen. Then he stopped. The engineer's face went pale. "That's impossible," he said. Edward leaned closer. "What?" Takashi pointed at the result. "In a sealed capsule with reduced airflow."
He hesitated. "The oxygen level could drop below safe limits in less than 10 minutes. Nakamura frowned. "But the airflow wasn't sealed." Takashi nodded quickly. "Yes." Edward looked back at the capsule diagram. "Are you sure?" he asked. Takashi hesitated. Then he zoomed into the exhaust channel connected to Capsule 47. Edward leaned forward. The diagram showed a thin ventilation tube running from the capsule to the main exhaust shaft. Normal, standard, until Takashi froze. "What is it?" Nakamura asked. Takashi pointed at the screen. "There was a pressure change," he said. Edward looked closer. The log displayed a brief spike in airflow resistance at 0214, 2 minutes before the victim woke. Edward's eyes narrowed. "Pressure resistance," he said. Takashi nodded slowly. "Yes." Edward straightened. "That means something blocked the exhaust." Nakamura frowned. "But the system never reported a malfunction." Takashi swallowed. "Because it wasn't a system failure," he said. Edward looked at him. "What was it?" Takashi hesitated. "Something inside the exhaust tube," he said. Edward smiled faintly. "Finally, a physical problem. Something real. Something that could be touched." Nakamura crossed his arms. "You're saying someone blocked the air from leaving the capsule?" Takashi nodded. "Yes." Edward turned back toward the stairs leading to the sleeping level. "And once the carbon dioxide built up," Nakamura finished the thought, "he suffocated." Edward nodded. The detective frowned. "But the tube connects to the central shaft," Nakamura said. "No one could reach it from the corridor." Edward smiled slightly. "Of course not." He started walking toward the stairs. Nakamura followed. "Then how did someone block it?" the detective asked. Edward paused at the doorway. Then he looked back toward the ventilation diagram one last time. "Not from the corridor," he said. He pointed upward. "From the capsule above." Chapter 3. The Capsule Above. Capsule hotels were designed with ruthless efficiency. Every centimeter of space had been calculated, measured, and optimized to fit the maximum number of sleeping compartments into the smallest possible volume. The result was a grid of identical units stacked in precise vertical rows, which meant one thing: every capsule had a neighbor above it and another below. Edward Hale stood in the corridor again, staring up at the number painted on the capsule above the crime scene.
93, directly above Capsule 47. Detective Nakamura followed his gaze. "You think the answer is up there?" the detective said. Edward nodded. "Most structures hide their secrets vertically," he said. Nakamura frowned. "What does that mean?" Edward pointed to Capsule 47. "The exhaust line runs upward," he said. Then he pointed to Capsule 93, "which means the easiest place to block it," he paused, "is the capsule above." Nakamura checked his notes. "The guest in Capsule 93 checked out at 7 this morning," he said. Edward nodded. "Tourist from Osaka." "Yes." Nakamura frowned. "We questioned him." Edward looked at him. "And?" "He said he slipped through the night." Edward smiled faintly. That's what most people say. The detective peeled back another strip of police tape. Let's see what he slept above, Nakamura said. The door of Capsule 93 slid open. Edward leaned inside. The compartment looked identical to Capsule 47. Same mattress, same control panel, same faint smell of disinfectant and recycled air. But Edward immediately noticed something else. The floor of the capsule had a small circular maintenance panel near the foot. Edward crouched carefully inside the compartment. The capsule's ceiling was low enough that he had to tilt his head sideways. Maintenance access, Nakamura said. Edward nodded. For the ventilation line. He tapped the panel lightly. The hollow metallic sound echoed through the narrow space. Edward looked toward the capsule below. Capsule 47, the dead man's compartment, separated only by a thin structural layer and a ventilation channel. Edward opened the maintenance panel. The cover lifted easily. Inside, a narrow tube ran vertically downward, the exhaust ventilation. Edward leaned closer. "Flashlight," he said. Nakamura handed him a small inspection light. Edward shone the beam into the tube. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then something caught the edge of the light. A small, dark object lodged against the inner wall. Edward reached carefully inside the opening. The tube was narrow, but not inaccessible. His fingers touched something soft, flexible. He pulled it free. Nakamura leaned closer. "What is it?" Edward held the object up. A small, black rubber plug. Nakamura stared at it. "You're kidding." Edward turned the plug slowly between his fingers. "No," he said. The object was simple.
A cylinder of soft rubber about 2 centimeters wide, exactly the right size to block a narrow air tube. Nakamura frowned. So someone pushed this into the exhaust line. Edward nodded. Yes. The detective crossed his arms, and when the airflow slowed, Edward finished the thought. Carbon dioxide built up inside the capsule. Nakamura exhaled slowly. That would suffocate someone in minutes. Edward nodded. Yes. The detective looked at the plug again, but the victim could have removed it. Edward shook his head. Not from inside. He pointed into the ventilation tube. The plug sits above the exhaust junction, he said. Nakamura leaned closer to examine the tube. Edward was right. The rubber piece had been inserted from above. Once lodged in place, it could not be reached from the capsule below. Nakamura rubbed his chin. So someone in Capsule 93 pushed it down the tube. Edward nodded. Yes? The detective frowned. But why would the victim go into sleep mode? Edward smiled slightly. Because he thought he was going to sleep. Edward replaced the maintenance panel and slid out of the capsule. The corridor felt strangely quiet again. Rows of identical white doors stretched in both directions like a geometric maze. Nakamura stepped beside him. So the tourist from Osaka killed him, the detective said. Edward shook his head. No. Nakamura frowned. Why not? Edward pointed at the capsule door. Because the tourist checked in at midnight. Nakamura blinked. And the victim entered his capsule at 23:14. Edward nodded. The plug was already in place. The detective frowned deeply now. Wait, he said. Edward nodded. Yes. The idea had begun forming in his mind the moment he saw the rubber plug. Capsule hotels had one peculiar design feature. Guests did not enter directly into their sleeping units. First, they visited the locker area, shoes removed, belongings stored. Then they moved upstairs, which meant the sleeping floors were briefly empty every evening while guests arrived one by one. Edward turned slowly toward the corridor entrance. The killer didn't use Capsule 93, he said. Nakamura crossed his arms. Then who did? Edward looked at the rows of capsules again. 200 identical compartments, 200 identical ventilation tubes, 200 opportunities. Edward smiled faintly. The killer used the building itself. Nakamura frowned. That's not an answer. Edward began walking down the corridor. It will be, he said. They reached the end of the hallway, At the far wall, a small locked cabinet held the building's maintenance equipment. Edward stopped. Then he pointed at the door. Nakamura looked confused. What? Edward nodded toward the cabinet. The person who installed that plug, he said, didn't need to rent a capsule. Nakamura's eyes narrowed slightly. You think it was someone who worked here? Edward nodded. Yes. The detective opened the cabinet slowly. Inside hung the tools used by the hotel's maintenance staff, screwdrivers, inspection lights, replacement filters, and a small plastic box filled with identical black rubber plugs. Nakamura stared at them. Ventilation stoppers, he said quietly. Edward nodded. Yes. The detective looked back at him. So someone from the staff placed it. Edward smiled faintly. Or someone who knew where the staff kept their tools. Nakamura frowned. You already know who it is. Edward nodded. Yes. The detective folded his arms. Then tell me. Edward looked down the corridor one last time. Rows of silent capsules stretched into the distance, each one hiding a sleeping stranger, each one almost identical, except for one, Capsule 47. Edward turned back toward Nakamura. The killer, he said quietly, was the only person in this building who knew exactly which capsule Tanaka would choose.
Chapter 4. The Reservation. Edward Hale had noticed something peculiar about modern hotels. The buildings themselves appeared anonymous, but the systems that ran them were not. Behind every door number, every key card, every capsule assignment, there was a database quietly recording the choices of hundreds of strangers. In places like the Hikari capsule residence, people rarely spoke to each other, but the system knew exactly where everyone slept. Edward stood in the small administrative office beside the lobby while the hotel manager nervously logged into the reservation terminal. The manager's name was Hiroshi Sato. He was a thin man in his late 50s who looked as if the events of the morning had aged him several years overnight. "We have already given the police access to the logs," he said. Detective Nakamura nodded. "We're aware." Edward stepped closer to the monitor. "Show me last night's check-ins." Sato typed several commands. Rows of guest records appeared. Times, names, capsule assignments. Edward scanned the list. "Here," Nakamura said. He pointed to one entry. "Tanaka, Rio. Check-in 2314. Assigned capsule 47. Edward nodded. "Was the assignment automatic?" he asked. Sato shook his head. "Partially," he said. Edward waited. "Our system suggests capsules automatically," Sato explained, "but staff can adjust the assignment if needed." Edward tilted his head slightly. "For example?" Sato shrugged. "If a guest prefers a lower level or a quieter corridor." Edward nodded slowly. "So the system does not choose the capsule alone?" "No." Edward glanced at Nakamura. "Interesting." Edward leaned closer to the screen. "Who was working the desk last night?" he asked. Sato looked uncomfortable. "The night attendant," he said. Edward waited. "Her name is Aiko Mori." Nakamura frowned slightly. "Mori?" Edward noticed the same thing. Takashi Mori, the engineer. Aiko Mori, the attendant. Edward said nothing yet. "Call her," Nakamura said. Sato nodded and reached for the phone. Aiko Mori arrived 10 minutes later. She was in her early 30s, dressed in the same minimalist uniform worn by the other staff members. Her expression remained calm, but Edward noticed the slight stiffness in her shoulders the moment she saw the detective. She bowed politely. "You wanted to speak with me?" Nakamura gestured toward the desk. "About last night." She nodded. "I understand." Edward watched her carefully. "Did you check in, Mr. Tanaka?" "Yes." "At 2314? "Yes." Edward pointed toward the screen. "And you assigned capsule 47? She nodded. "That is correct." Edward tilted his head slightly. "Why that capsule?" She hesitated. "It was available." Edward waited. That's all? She nodded again. Yes. Edward leaned against the desk. Capsule hotels were built on uniformity, but human choices rarely were. Capsule 47, Edward said slowly. Middle corridor. She said nothing. Edward continued. Directly beneath Capsule 93. Her expression did not change. Edward walked slowly across the office. Earlier today, he said, we found something inside the ventilation line above Capsule 47. Nakamura watched her carefully. Aiko Mori remained silent. Edward placed the rubber plug on the desk. The small black cylinder rolled slightly before coming to rest near the keyboard. Her eyes moved to it for less than a second, then back to Edward. That plug, Edward said quietly, blocked the exhaust airflow.
She said nothing. Edward continued. Which means someone inserted it from Capsule 93. Silence filled the office. Nakamura crossed his arms. The guest in Capsule 93 was a tourist, he said. Edward nodded. And he arrived hours after Tanaka. Aiko Mori looked down at the desk. Edward spoke gently. You knew that. She did not respond. Edward leaned forward slightly. You knew Tanaka would sleep in Capsule 47, he said. Still nothing. Edward glanced at the reservation screen. Because you assigned it. Her hands tightened slightly. Nakamura spoke next. And you had access to the maintenance tools. Edward gestured toward the plug. And to the ventilation system. Silence. Edward watched her face carefully. People often believed that anger was the strongest emotion during interrogations, but grief was far more dangerous, because grief could wait. You knew Ryo Tanaka, Edward said quietly. Her head lifted. For the first time, something appeared in her expression. Not fear, recognition. Edward continued. 5 years ago, he said, your brother died. Nakamura glanced at him. Edward nodded. Yes, he said. He had found the record earlier while reviewing the victim's background. Tanaka's name had appeared once before, in a corporate investigation. A data theft case, Edward said. He blamed your brother. Aiko Mori's hands trembled slightly. Edward continued quietly. Your brother lost his job. He paused. 6 months later, he killed himself. The room remained silent. Finally, Aiko Mori spoke. Her voice was calm. Tanaka destroyed him. Edward nodded. Yes. She looked at the rubber plug on the desk. He slept well that night, she said. Edward said nothing. I watched him check in. He didn't even remember my brother's name. Edward leaned slightly forward. So you planned the capsule? She nodded. Yes. Nakamura exhaled slowly. And the plug? She nodded again. I inserted it before my shift ended. Edward glanced at the reservation screen. And then you waited. Her voice was quiet. Yes. Nakamura shook his head. You could have called the police. Aiko Mori looked at him. For what? Nakamura hesitated. Edward answered instead. For justice. She smiled faintly. That word, she said, means very different things to different people. Edward picked up the rubber plug. You knew sleep mode would reduce airflow. She nodded. And once the exhaust blocked, Edward finished the thought. The capsule became a coffin. She looked down. Yes. Edward studied her face. Did you watch him go upstairs? She nodded. Yes. And then? She went home. Edward nodded. She had not needed to stay. The capsule itself would finish the work. Nakamura stepped forward. You understand what you've done. Aiko Mori looked at him calmly. Yes. Edward glanced toward the lobby window. Tokyo traffic moved slowly outside. Millions of strangers sharing the same city. most of them never knowing each other existed. Edward placed the rubber plug back on the desk. "You didn't kill him with a weapon," he said. She said nothing. Edward continued, "You killed him with a room." Her eyes lifted. Edward nodded once. "Yes," he said quietly, "a very small room." Chapter 5. The Capsule. Detective Nakamura placed the rubber plug into a small evidence bag and sealed it slowly. Aiko Mori sat quietly across the desk, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She did not attempt to deny what Edward had already reconstructed. The story was no longer a mystery to her, only to the world outside the room. Edward watched the evidence bag for a moment. A simple piece of rubber, 2 centimeters wide, light enough to fit in the palm of a hand, and powerful enough to turn a sleeping capsule into a sealed chamber. Nakamura looked at Edward. "Walk me through it," the detective said. Edward nodded. He had already done so in his mind several times. Now he spoke aloud. "Aiko inserts the plug into the exhaust line above capsule 47, Edward said. Nakamura nodded. "Before the guests arrive." Edward continued. "The capsule itself still receives oxygen through the intake vent." Nakamura frowned slightly. "Which means Tanaka does not notice anything immediately." Edward nodded. "Correct." He gestured toward the capsule corridor upstairs. "Once he activates sleep mode, the airflow drops by 40%. Nakamura remembered the engineer's numbers. "That reduces fresh oxygen," he said. Edward nodded again. "Yes." He paused. "And more importantly," Edward tapped the desk lightly, "carbon dioxide can no longer leave the capsule." Nakamura leaned back. "So the air inside the compartment slowly changes." Edward nodded. "Exactly." He continued. "Tanaka falls asleep." Nakamura followed the timeline. "And several hours later, the carbon dioxide level rises." Edward nodded. "That's when he wakes." The detective exhaled quietly. "And begins to suffocate." Edward stood and walked slowly to the office window. Outside, Tokyo traffic flowed like a river of metal and light. "Small spaces amplify human mistakes," he said quietly. Nakamura looked at him. "How so?" Edward turned back. "In a normal room," he said, "air circulates naturally." He paused. "But inside a capsule," Edward gestured with his hands, "every breath matters." Nakamura nodded slowly, "Which means Tanaka had no chance." Edward shook his head. "No." The detective frowned. "What do you mean?" Edward leaned slightly against the desk. "He had a chance." Nakamura waited. Edward continued. "If he had opened the door immediately." Nakamura blinked. "But the door was not locked." Edward nodded. "Correct." The detective frowned. "Then why didn't he escape?" Edward looked toward the hallway. "Because people do not immediately assume the room itself is killing them." Edward spoke calmly now, reconstructing the final minutes. "Tanaka wakes up. He feels short of breath." Nakamura nodded. "He checks the control panel." Edward nodded. "The ventilation appears normal." The detective followed the logic. "So he assumes the problem is temporary." Edward nodded. "Yes." He paused. "By the time he realizes the truth," Edward looked at the rubber plug again, "his body is already too weak." Silence filled the office. Aiko Mori finally spoke again. "He struggled," she said quietly. Edward looked at her. "You knew that?" She nodded once. "Yes." Edward said nothing. Nakamura folded his arms. "There is still something I don't understand." Edward waited. The detective continued.
Why Capsule 47? Edward smiled faintly. That is the clever part. Nakamura raised an eyebrow. Explain. Edward walked back to the reservation terminal. He opened the building diagram again. Capsule 47 sat exactly halfway down the corridor. Middle capsules, Edward said, are the most predictable assignments. Nakamura frowned. Because the system fills corridors evenly. Edward nodded. Yes. He pointed at the screen. When Tanaka checked in late, the algorithm suggested 47. Nakamura looked at Aiko Mori. And you confirmed it. She nodded. Edward leaned back. You didn't choose a capsule randomly, he said. You chose the one the system would choose. Aiko Mori remained silent, but her eyes confirmed it. Nakamura exhaled slowly. So the murder depended on 3 things. Edward nodded. Correct. He counted them calmly. First, Tanaka had to choose sleep mode. Second, he had to remain inside the capsule. Third, the ventilation plug had to remain hidden. Nakamura looked at the rubber stopper, and all 3 happened. Edward nodded. Yes. He paused. But there was one mistake. Aiko Mori looked up. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in her expression. Edward spoke quietly. The pressure log. Nakamura nodded. The engineer found it. Edward continued. The system detected resistance in the exhaust line. He glanced toward the evidence bag. That was the moment the plug shifted. Aiko Mori looked down again. Edward finished the thought. You underestimated the sensors. Nakamura stepped forward. You planned everything. Aiko Mori nodded slowly. Yes. Edward watched her. But you never expected anyone to investigate the ventilation system. She looked up again. No. Edward nodded. Most people would have blamed the capsule. Nakamura placed the evidence bag into his coat pocket. Outside the office, the quiet sounds of the Capsule Hotel continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Guests checked in. Shoes were placed in lockers. Tiny doors slid shut. 200 strangers prepared to sleep in boxes stacked along the corridor. Edward walked toward the exit. Nakamura followed him. You solved it quickly, the detective said. Edward shrugged slightly. Rooms that small rarely hide the truth for long. They reached the staircase leading back to the street. Behind them, Aiko Mori remained seated in the office.
Waiting. The silence inside the hotel felt deeper now. Nakamura looked at Edward one last time. Strange place to die, the detective said. Edward nodded. Yes. He paused. In a city this large, Edward glanced toward the sleeping floors above them. People build smaller and smaller rooms. The detective waited. Edward finished the thought quietly. And sometimes, he said, the smallest room in the building becomes the most dangerous one. Epilogue: The Sleeping City. 3 weeks later, the Hikari capsule residence was full again. The police tape had been removed, the ventilation system had been inspected, tested, and certified by engineers who spoke with the calm confidence of people who believed machines behaved logically. The capsule that had once been marked 47 was now spotless. New mattress, new control panel, even the ventilation grill had been replaced. The management decided it was easier to replace the hardware than to replace the story. Edward Hale stood across the street from the hotel entrance, watching the steady movement of people entering the building. Most of them were office workers, tired men loosening their ties, women checking their phones as they walked. Some carried small overnight bags, others carried nothing at all. To them, the building was not unusual. It was simply a place to sleep. Tokyo was full of places like this. Capsule hotels had become a quiet solution to a modern problem.
The city had grown too large for everyone to go home every night, so people rented sleep instead. 2 meters long, 1 meter high, a private space just big enough to disappear for a few hours. Detective Nakamura joined Edward on the sidewalk. "You came back," the detective said. Edward nodded. "Yes." Nakamura looked at the hotel sign. "Curious?" Edward smiled faintly. "Always." The automatic doors opened. 2 businessmen stepped inside without speaking to each other. They scanned their identification cards at the kiosk. The system assigned them capsules. Their shoes disappeared into lockers. Then they walked upstairs to the sleeping floors. Nakamura watched them go. "You know what most people believe," the detective said. Edward looked at him. "What?" "They believe the machine killed him." Edward nodded. "Yes." It was a comforting explanation. Machines malfunction, systems fail, technology makes mistakes. Those ideas were easier to accept than the alternative. Nakamura folded his arms. "But the machine worked perfectly." Edward nodded. "It did." The detective waited. Edward continued quietly. "That's what made it dangerous." Across the street, a delivery truck passed slowly through traffic. Above the street, the windows of office towers reflected the fading evening light like rows of mirrors. The city never truly stopped moving, not even at night. Nakamura glanced at Edward. "You think places like this will keep existing?" Edward looked at the hotel again. "Yes." The detective raised an eyebrow. "Even after what happened?" Edward nodded. "Yes." He paused. "Because cities create spaces like this." Nakamura frowned. "What do you mean?" Edward gestured toward the crowded street. "When millions of people live close together," he said, "they start building smaller and smaller private worlds." The detective waited. Edward finished the thought quietly. "And sometimes," he said, "the smallest room in the building becomes the most dangerous one." For a moment, neither man spoke. The hotel sign flickered quietly above the entrance. Inside, the check-in machines continued assigning capsules to strangers who would never meet each other. Nakamura finally spoke. "You know what bothers me most about the case?" Edward looked at him. "What?" The detective nodded toward the building. "No one noticed anything." Edward nodded. "That's the nature of cities." Nakamura frowned. "How so?" Edward watched the automatic doors open again. Another guest entered, another capsule assigned, another door sliding shut somewhere above the corridor. Edward spoke quietly. "In places like this," he said, "people sleep only a few centimeters away from each other." He paused, "But they might as well be miles apart." Nakamura looked up at the sleeping floors hidden behind the concrete walls. Rows of capsules, rows of strangers, rows of tiny private worlds. Edward turned to leave. Behind him, the capsule hotel continued operating exactly as designed. 200 compartments, 200 sleeping bodies, 200 quiet breaths filling small spaces in the middle of the largest city in the world. And somewhere inside that building, in a capsule identical to all the others, someone slid the door closed and lay down to sleep, trusting the room around them, trusting the air, trusting the silence. Edward walked slowly into the evening traffic. Because sometimes the most dangerous rooms in the world were not prisons and not vaults. Sometimes they were simply boxes, just large enough for a person to sleep.
Capsule hotels are designed for one purpose: sleep. Tiny rooms stacked like drawers in a giant cabinet. Hundreds of strangers breathing quietly in the same corridor. But one night in Capsule 47, the air slowly disappeared.